And I'm really happy to have Michelle with us today because she was one of her participants to the All Women Crew in 2020. And she was stranded as all of us because of COVID. So it's really a great pleasure to have her today. So Michelle is the co-director of the Center for Art and Space Law at the University of Mississippi. And she's the co-founder of the All Womankind, a nonprofit to preserve the human cultural heritage in outer space. And she is a very important space lawyer. So let me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so deeply honored to be here after spending the afternoon with you all and listening to these amazing visions and creative ideas. I think, oh my God, I'm just a lawyer. What do I have to say? So bear with me. I am a lawyer. I'm a space lawyer. I teach space law at the University of Mississippi. I'm also the co-founder of an organization called For All Womankind. And our mission is to protect our cultural heritage in outer space, starting with the lunar landing sites. And as we embarked on our journey of protecting cultural heritage and sort of looking at how space law completely ignores everything of cultural value in any aspect, we realized that's a real gap in space law and in the governance and regulation of our activities in space. And so it's really fascinating to me because last night I hosted a panel on the ethics of space exploration, which is nobody's talking about at this point. And we are proud to be starting within For All Womankind an institute on the ethics of space exploration. And I'm thinking that the artists here would have so much to offer to that. And so I'm hoping that we can make this truly an interdisciplinary effort. And but I'm so in awe. So I'm sorry, I'm just going to start talking and hope that I'm not too dull after all of the creativity we had. So I'm going to talk about why we would care about Bootprints on the moon, and we're going to look at the legal and social issues. I know that I have 20 minutes, so I might not get through much of it, but the human activity on the moon actually started with the landing of Luna 2 in 1957. So the Soviet Union landed this very small spacecraft on the moon. It crash landed, but it contained a sphere which was stamped USSR in the year 1957. So a lot of people don't realize or remember that really the Soviet Union got there first. They did the hard landing and they did a soft landing, and they have these medallions. And I think sort of thinking about the cultural aspect and talking about DNA going to the moon and, how important it is for humans to just sort of say, I was here, like the graffiti, So the Soviet Union was very successful on the moon. They had the first soft landing on the moon with Luna 9. They put the first wheels on the moon with Lunokhod 1. And they had about 20-some Luna missions. Of course, everyone remembers most the first human landing of the moon, Apollo 11. And I go quickly through the Apollo because what we've done at For All Womankind is actually create a registry of all of the artifacts that we know that are on the moon. And so, for example, Apollo 11, they left an olive branch. They left messages of peace that were etched on a disc the size of a US $50. And they got messages of peace from 74 nations around the world. And it's the story of, going to diplomatic missions and asking for a message. About 3 days before they launched, and a lot of the countries saying, I really have no idea what you're talking about. And so that's why they only got 74. But these messages of peace, we're talking about poetry, and they literally all say things like, best of luck. Let's hope that this starts our journey to peace on earth. This starts our journey to kinship and brotherhood. And really the hope that was contained in those messages when we first set humans off to another celestial body is really inspiring. Somebody was talking about the first museum on the moon. Legend has it there's already a museum on the moon. Apollo 12, there was a whole PBS TV show about whether this is a ceramic tile, which includes works by Andy Warhol. And the rumor has it that one of the engineers stuck it to the leg of the lunar lander, and that it's on the moon right now as our first moon museum. Now, it's entirely against the law for an engineer to have done that. And so nobody has confirmed or denied it at this point. So we will have to go back and find out, right? Apollo 13 is the first golf on the moon when Alan Shepard shanked a golf ball. Apollo 15 were the first human-driven wheels on the moon, and also a plaque that was left. And one thing I want to point out about the plaque, and also I should have mentioned with Apollo 11, is the plaque is a list of all of the astronauts and cosmonauts who had died up to that point in the human effort to reach the moon. So always these efforts to reach the moon have been very human and universal. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had a choice of what to carry with them, very small, things. But one of the things they carried with them were the medallions of the 2 Russian cosmonauts who had passed away in this race to the moon. So when Neil Armstrong said, this step is for all humankind, he really meant it. Apollo 16, we have the first family photo left on the moon. And Apollo 17, of course, was our last mission. So we're looking at, in December of this year, 50 years since a human has set foot on the moon. And so there's a lot of plans on going back. Artemis is supposed to go in 2024. The Chinese might get there sooner. I hope that, for me, the sooner the better. But of course, there's also many, many other artifacts on the moon, because it wasn't just humans who went. We sent a lot of representatives in the way of robots, right? The Chinese have sent Chang'e U-2-1 and U-2-2. Prior to Apollo, we sent a bunch of surveyors and other robotic instruments. So all of these things are sitting on the moon. And what's really amazing is because the moon has very little gravity, because it has no weather, all of the things are perfectly preserved. You can see there's a lunar orbiter. You can see from the LRO the footsteps of the astronauts still there. So these are amazing treasures. And the problem is, as we go back, these treasures, they're not protected by anything. There's not any law, nothing can prevent anybody from going and picking up or running over those tracks. And that's really, to us, a critical gap, because those artifacts that are on the moon, those bootprints, those rover tracks, they memorialize the 400,000 people who worked on the Apollo missions, right? And all of the engineers who worked on Chang'e or Luna missions. And all of these are real people who worked anonymously. They don't have their names on plaques. They don't have statues. They worked anonymously to get these humans and robots to the moon. But it's so much more than that. So when we think about going to the moon, we do not get to the moon without centuries of human endeavor and human achievement. We also need to think about the moon as one of those singular human achievements that will change forever the trajectory of our species. So we think about discovering how to harness fire instead of being afraid of it. That changed the trajectory of the human species. When we looked at the water and decided, we're going to build a boat and sail over it, we're not afraid of it. That changed the trajectory of our species. When we learned how to draw and we used caves to draw about hunting scenes, about animals we've seen, that changed the trajectory of human history. And we don't get to the moon without any of that. We don't get to the moon without a person in the Congo picking up a baboon bone and starting rudimentary math on it, right? We don't get to the moon without math. We don't get to the moon without somebody in Mesopotamia looking at sand and thinking, if I heat this up, I can make something like glass. We don't get to the moon without glass. And so all of these events in history throughout all of our cultures, the cultures that have been forgotten and lost, they've all contributed through dreaming, just simply dreaming of the stars. That beautiful image you had of Aztecs. Just every person who's ever dreamed about the stars, every individual who looked up in wonder, is part of our human steps into the future and into our space. So, we don't get to the moon without these footsteps in Laetoli, Tanzania. 3 million years ago, somebody stood up on 2 feet and started to walk. I like to think it was a mother running after a child, right? Because, but we don't know why that individual stood up, but we are all related through those footsteps to each other. And what's amazing is when we stood up on those 2 feet, that's when we freed up our hands to make tools. That's when we freed up our hands to draw. That's when we learned how to really start communicating. We were able to start carrying things. And that these footsteps, they're protected, they're preserved by the World Heritage Convention. So here on Earth, we understand culture and the importance of it really well. Also in 1969, at the same time as humans were trying to reach the moon, Egypt wanted to build a dam in the Nubia Valley. The Aswan High Dam would help Egypt modernize its economy, but it would also bury tens of hundreds of temples known as one of the cradles of human civilization. So Egypt reached out to the world community and said, what should we do? And the world didn't say, stop, you can't do that. No, they said, you know what? You need to develop, but we also need to save our history. And the world came together and raised $40 million, and they moved those temples out of the Nubia Valley piece by piece. This is in the early 1970s. It was not an easy thing to do from an engineering standpoint. And out of that came the World Heritage Convention and this understanding that preservation is a compelling idea that can help unite people rather than divide them. It can build a sense of community amongst people throughout the world. I like to go back to Polynesia when I would tell people how important it is to preserve our cultural heritage in outer space, to make sure that as we go back to the moon, as we go to Mars and beyond, we're not just sort of erasing our history. I mean, it took those footsteps in Laetoli were found in the 1970s. We don't want a million years from now our future, our generations to have to go digging around on the moon looking for Neil Armstrong's bootprint, right? We need to preserve it for them. So why is culture so important? The closest analogy we have to space exploration is the Polynesian movement across the oceans, right? So these very hardy people on these little islands looked out at a horizon that had nothing on it, no mountains, nothing. It was just open water. And what did they do? They didn't say, oh, we shouldn't go out there. No, they said, no, wow, that is drawing us. We are going to go and we are going to explore it because that is what humans do. And not all humans, a lot of humans stayed home too, but so they did what we're doing now. They built boats, they built crafts to propel them across those waters. But they didn't leave everything behind. They took with them their culture, and that's why you see so many similarities. They took with them all of their traditions. They took with them the understanding of agriculture and how to grow things across these different islands. I really find it ironic because when the Hokulea was built long before the Europeans had found the Polynesian islands, and think about if the Western world had appreciated other cultures, maybe they would have learned a lot from Hokulea and not have wasted a lot of time building their own boats in a different fashion. And this is a really important lesson for humanity as we go into space, because we will only do it successfully and sustainably if we do it together, because we need the diversity of our people, the beautiful diversity of geography, of age, of generation, of gender, everything. In order to be successful, because only the most creative ideas come from that. Oh, I'm running out of time. Okay. And so I think it's, I put this in because to me, this is our boat from Polynesia sailing into the future. So now I have a lot of really boring slides about the Outer Space Treaty. Fundamentally, we know that the Outer Space Treaty does one very important thing, and it says that space is the province of all of humankind, and that all humans have the freedom of exploration and use of space. Okay. When I first started teaching space law, I spent a lot of time talking about what it means to be the providence of all humankind. But now I've changed in the 5 years that I've been teaching. I realize I step back even farther and think the hubris of the Outer Space Treaty to say that space belongs to all humans. Who are we to to make that kind of statement about outer space. You know, who are we to say, yeah, this is us, this is our backyard, this is ours. We are a part of this cosmos, just like all of the other beings, sentient beings, organic things that we haven't seen yet, who have every bit as much right to this space as we do. But we do have, our laws do say that we have this freedom of exploration and use. And this is a very broad freedom. There are very few things that restrict that. We cannot put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in space. We have to abide by international laws in space. We cannot claim, states cannot claim territory in space, are the only restrictions. There's only one more restriction, and I call it the due regard. It's called the Article 9, the due regard provision. And it says that humans must conduct activities in space with due regard for the corresponding activities of others. So what does that mean, even? Due regard to you probably means common sense, being cordial, responsible. Due regard to a lawyer is a bunch of gobbledygook. And I call this the cha-ching provision for lawyers, because we can argue about what due regard is, because it's a balancing test. We can argue about that for decades. And so what we really have to do, what our generation, what our job is now, is to figure out, to learn how to be, give each other due regard, to be responsible towards each other, without having to rely on lawyers to do that. And so for me, this interdisciplinary, this bringing of the world together through art, has a lot, is a fundamental part of what we're trying to do on the legal side, but through a lot of boring seminars, you know, through the week that we had here in Paris at the IAC. This is our very first upright footstep. This is our very first footstep on another celestial body. One is protected, lovingly covered. It's in Tanzania. It was found underneath some soil. They actually cover it with that soil again, and only uncover it when you are able to show a compelling reason that you want to see it. Otherwise, you can't go there. The other, it's just there. We have more than 400 missions planned for the moon in the next decade, both robotic and human, both from states like the US and China and India, and from even more commercial entities. There's not one thing right now protecting that bootprint. There's nothing that says you cannot run over that bootprint, that you can't just go and scoop up that regolith and bring it back to Earth and sell it for millions of dollars, right? The Neil Armstrong's bag, Neil Armstrong was the first person on the moon. He collected the first lunar regolith sample. He brought it back in the first moon bag. NASA lost control of that bag, and it ended up in a flea market. Somebody bought it for $400. They sent it to NASA. NASA confirmed, yes, you found our bag, thank God. What did the person do? Sold it at auction at Sotheby's for $3 million. Okay, this is valuable stuff right now. And there's a lot of reasons somebody would want to go to the moon and take that soil and bring it back. And so For All Moonkind is looking to create a treaty to prevent that from happening. We believe that the only way we can go to space is together as a community, as a human community. And the first way to start that is to agree that as a human community, we are universally going to accept that we have cultural heritage in outer space, and that it needs to be protected, and that we will protect it. So of course I have to end with Bernard de Chartres. We are dwarves sitting on the shoulders of giants, but the giants aren't just the engineers of Apollo. It's not just the astronauts of Apollo. It's not just the engineers of Chang'e or Luna. We're standing on the shoulders of an entire evolution of our species. Everything that we have done, everything that we have accomplished comes because of those before us. And we owe it as part of our intergenerational equity. We owe it to our past and to all the cultures that are relying on us to keep their memories alive. And we owe it to our future, who are relying on us to explore space peacefully and successfully and sustainably, to act today to protect our bootprints. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Anybody wants to comment or to react or, oh God, we're coming.
Thank you so much. I'm Ellie. I'm a scholar of museum studies, and one of the things I'm really interested in is the dominance of Western values in museum tradition, in particular the idea of preservation. And so I was fascinated by your juxtaposition of the examples of kind of Polynesian tradition and particularly other indigenous cultures where letting things decay and letting them fade away is an important part of the tradition of those items, right? We see this with, for example, totem poles, where they're not meant to be preserved long term. They're designed in a way that's meant to be degraded. And so I was wondering if maybe you could comment a little bit on why Western values of preservation dominate over, for example, cultural relations to the moon that was untouched. So why is it that we should keep the stuff there rather than getting rid of it? So that the moon resembles what it was when people had other relations with the moon before it was touched by humans in a physical sense. Thanks.
So that's a really interesting thought process because, as you likely know, the indigenous communities, primarily in the First Nations in Canada, were vehemently opposed to anybody landing on the moon. So we do. From Unkind in particular works with the indigenous community in the United States because one of the things we're talking about is we're not going to be able to stop people going back to the moon. And so what we want to do is make sure that it is done responsibly and respectfully. And so what does that mean? That means that the moon is something special to us and that lunar governance needs to be very, very different from the governance of asteroids, for example, that nobody's ever seen. So this came up in our ethics conversation yesterday as well. Is humans have done such a poor job here on Earth, and why do we have the right to go? I can't answer the question about Western ideals. I can say that we're not talking about protecting every single thing that's on the moon. We just want people to think about what should be protected. Ideally, a lot of the stuff, Harrison Schmitt, Apollo 17 astronaut, said to me, I don't want to preserve any of it. We should just be recycling it because it costs a lot to get something to the moon. And right now it's just sitting up there like garbage. And so we really need to think about what is garbage or should be recycled and what is something that needs to be preserved. I will say, ethically speaking, as I said, I think we owe it. I think it's an inevitability, but we owe it to our ancestors and to our future to use the moon as a jumping off point. I don't see the moon becoming like a hotel destination. I don't want to see that. But the moon is a proving ground for us. And if we can do it responsibly, we can use the moon to springboard, not to Mars, but to asteroids where we can harness resources that will help us return Earth to its pristine condition. Thank you.
But there is also many issues with the moon, and which is they want to mine it. And so far, at this point in time, there is no serious legal international agreement not to do that. B, if we do it, not how we are going to do it. And 3, who's going to own the material and how much money they are going to make out of it, what they are going to make out of it. There is this nice idea that it belongs to everyone, but we know it's not true. So I would like you to reflect on this possession, and yeah.
Possession is a really fraught concept, and we've talked to we've spent a lot of time talking to indigenous communities for that very reason, is we don't want to bring this Western concept of property ownership. What can we do? We need to mine those resources, because if we want to put a human community on the moon, we can't keep sending water up to sustain them. So we're going to need to mine water on the moon. And so again, you're right. We need to put guardrails up, and there are none right now. And one thing that we need to do as a community is start waking people up to this truth that we are going back to the moon, and we want to harness the resources. And that makes sense because humans have to figure out how to live in space. Again, not because we're going to leave this earth and forsake it, but because we need to find the resources that exist in space that will help us return our Earth to its pristine conditions, that will help better the lives of the humans who decide to remain on Earth. And again, going to the moon has always been our closest neighbor and our closest celestial friend, and going to the moon is the first step to doing that.
Thank you.
Hi, Marie-Pierre. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about indigenous communities. I find it fascinating to look at them at their knowledge, but I'm also from Canada. I'm wondering, are we putting too much pressure also on indigenous communities to be responsible for providing us with the means to address these questions differently? I mean, as a university professor, we are now putting politics more of inclusion so that, there's more representative of these communities, but as a prof, for instance, sometimes we have to be careful at not inviting all the time the people that they feel that they have to represent their community. So do you come across any of these kind of issues in the way you deal with these questions, or?
Not at all, because at this point, they have never had a voice in any space policy. No indigenous community has had a voice in space policy in any country. And we're working closely with Stephen Friedland and Donna Lawler in Australia to bring the Aboriginal voice to the table. We're working in the U.S., as I said, and hopefully that will cross over with First Nations to bring their voice to the table. What we've learned is that the process of giving voice is very long, and so there's no sort of jump to this is the answer. Everything is a parable. Everything is an anecdote. And that in and of itself is a learning experience for Westerners. And so I don't think this is not, we're going to do it the way they said. This is, we're making sure they have a voice so that everybody's voice will be heard, and we will have all of the ideas on the table.
And then, in English, one last question, remark, comment. Yeah, Marcus. No, we need to record and the microphone doesn't pick up.
The question may be targeted more at the sector that's most active at the moment in sending things to space. That's the private sector. What is the legal component? I mean, surely there's a big team on that side, preparing the best vantage point possible. So when you're speaking about an inclusive process of trying to motivate towards a common, balanced legal position, surely you've got counterparts that are planning their own strategy in order to defend what they want to achieve. So where do these agendas meet, and how are those being negotiated? I mean, are there any kind of examples of previous encounters like this? I mean, it's sort of a different scale maybe, but that you might reflect on. Yeah.
Absolutely. First, I also want to just say, when we talk about space benefiting all of humanity, there is a lot of talk about, the Global South hasn't really received benefits yet. And don't forget that the remote sensing technology has greatly benefited all of humanity in life-changing ways, and that is a human benefit of space, that maybe the Global South doesn't have their own remote sensing satellites, but they are enjoying those benefits. There are a community of space lawyers. The Outer Space Treaty requires that nations authorize and supervise all activities of their nationals, so that's going to cover that private industry. Of course, the private industry has lawyers. Every state, it's a race, absolutely. And there's this sense of, and I'm going to tell you like it is. I'm a lawyer and it embarrasses me, but there's a sense of, on the commercial side, let's get there before the laws get there, so that we can exploit. There are two bodies right now working in earnest to prevent that. One is the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and that's a state-level organization. For All Moonkind is a permanent observer, and their state delegates are able to come together and talk about making regulations, and that's where our first space treaties came out of. That is not functioning that well now because of a little thing happening in the Ukraine. And that has boiled over. And so, and because of COVID, it wasn't able to meet in person, which makes diplomacy very difficult. And so the United States, with 8 other partners, negotiated the Artemis Accords, which are a bilateral, it's not an agreement, it's a sort of principles that they've agreed to. Right now, there's 22 nations that have signed on to these principles. And they basically say, yes, when we go back to the moon, we are going to absolutely support everything in the Outer Space Treaty. And we're also going to create a concept they call safety zones. So not property, it's a safety zone. And it's basically what they are also calling it, a notification zone. And so if you get there first, then you can tell people, oh, hey, in order to keep my equipment safe, you can't get too close. So problematic, absolutely. But this is what I want for heritage sites. I want to create a safety zone around the Tranquility Base. We're going to need some sort of concept like that because it is very destructive. The regolith is very destructive. And so what we need to do, we've done a fairly good job through the International Telecommunications Union of bartering orbital slots and saving orbital slots for the global south and rationing these out. So perhaps we have to do it that way on the moon. But what we don't want is this. I'm here first. And there are a very solid group of space lawyers working really hard to make sure that doesn't happen. Thank you.
With this hope, we'll end it here. Thank you very much,
Thank
Michelle.
you so much. Really, thank you, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity.